Good evening, everyone. My name is Justin Brandon, and I am a member of the mighty class of 2000. And I'm also currently serving as an incoming president of the Alumni Board. We are a working board with around 30 members representing classes from the 1950s to 2023. Our role is to support alumni engagement with current students and with the college, This webinar is a wonderful example of the types of alumni engagement that we seek to amplify. Alumni, students, staff, faculty, and members of our Macalester community, we had over 800 RSVPs for this conversation, including alumni from 12 different countries, representing a true Macalester international sense. Australia, Brazil, Canada, Cyprus, Germany, Israel, the Netherlands, the Philippines, South Korea, the Bahamas, the United Kingdom, and Singapore. Welcome, everyone. Before we get started, I'd like to share a few tech details with you all. Our utilization of Zoom is evidence that we are all continuing to learn. I will point you to the bottom of your Zoom screen. Closed captioning is available at the bottom of your screen. Q&A button is also there at the bottom of your screen. These questions will be added to our pre-submitted list. And I'll do my best to get as many questions as possible throughout our conversation this evening. If you have tech issues, please put those in the chat, and our crew of Macalester staff that are here tonight will help you and help all of us along the way to have a great evening tonight. This event is being recorded for those who were unable to attend. The recording will be shared with members of the community via the Mac Together webpage. So here's some opening information. This webinar is part of an ongoing Mac Together series, which aims to connect our Macalester community, even though we aren't able to hold in-person events at this time. We are grateful for the suggestions alumni have shared on what important issues you'd like to learn more about. That's why we're hosting today's program. We encourage you to continue sharing what ideas you have for future webinars. After Duchess's presentation, we have allocated a majority of our time today for questions shared when you registered or added throughout the program in the Q&A box. We have received over 100 questions through pre-registration, and we'll do our best to group and address as many as we can during our time together this evening. And now I'd like to introduce Professor Harris, Duchess, Miriam, lots of different names that she goes by. So tonight we're delighted to have our very own Macalester Professor of American Studies, Duchess Harris. She is a scholar of contemporary African-American history and political theory, and the proud curator of the Duchess Harris Collection, which has more than 115 books written for 4th through 12th graders, including a title on the Black Lives Matter and the #MeToo movement. Tonight, we will be talking about race and policing in the age of Black Lives Matter, a very timely topic. Challenging conversations are happening across the United States, focusing on the purpose and actions of police departments, particularly their disproportionate focus and impact on policing Black and minority lives. With current protests and calls to defund or abolish the police, it is critical to understand the deeper structural issues that cause racism to perpetuate in policing. Please join me in welcoming my former professor, Duchess Harris, to share more about the historical institutions and laws that underpin today's system.
Well, thank you so much, Justin. Justin did not share that he was one of my star students in the late 90s when I taught race, ethnicity, and politics in the political science department. So I'm delighted to be here this evening. Before I give this talk, I'd like to thank Dilreet Dalwitz, who's Macalester class of 2015, for helping me to design my slides. And so with that, I'm just going to pull my slides up. There they are. And what I'm going to do in this presentation is discuss two books that I've written. The first is on the Black Lives Matter movement, and the second is on race and policing. I will use these two books to address a question that many people have asked me almost every day in the last month. And that question is, how did we get here? So in this presentation, I will end with a call to action, but I will not have a solution for how we can dismantle 400 years of structural racism. So the title of tonight's presentation is Race and Policing in the Age of Black Lives Matter. And I am going to open up with sharing a little bit about myself that's outside of the Academy. Many people don't know that I am a member of the State Board of Public Defense. I was appointed in 2017 by former Governor Mark Dayton. The reason why I think this is relevant is because this isn't just a research project for me. I'm heavily involved in the community, and the work that we do is help public defenders with their work because they do legal defense for clients who often need extra support. And I think that's relevant to tonight's discussion. So I'm going to start off with one of my favorite political theorists, James Baldwin, who says in The Evidence of Things Not Seen, history, I contend, is the present. We, with every breath we take, every move we make, are history. And what goes around comes around. And so let me get started with the story of my Black Lives Matter book. In 2013, 2014, I was doing something that I loved tremendously. You might think that I was researching or writing or teaching something or advising someone, but that actually would not be true. I was on sabbatical, and you'll never meet a faculty member who does not love sabbatical. I was having a difficult time as August 2014 came around because it's always challenging to think about re-entering the classroom if you've been out of the classroom for a calendar year. As we moved into August, my anxiety increased because Michael Brown was shot on August 9th. This was something that I felt viscerally on a personal level, but also professionally. I was concerned about what it would mean for me to return to teaching 3 weeks later. I was scheduled to teach Introduction to African American Studies and Race in the Law. When I met with each of my classes, I found out that none of my students had had any experience talking about contemporary US race relations in high school. I think this is important because students sometimes have a unit on slavery, but students don't get the skill set in high school to talk about race relations. And it's an important skill set to have. I will admit the semester was challenging. It was almost as challenging as this past spring semester. But like any semester, it comes to the end and you move on. We went back for winter break and I was able to readjust for spring semester. As spring rolled around, an opportunity presented itself. In spring of 2015, I was contacted by a publisher who wanted to know if I would be a content consultant for a manuscript that they were already developing on the Black Lives Matter movement. It sounded like an intriguing project, particularly because it was for 6th to 12th graders. I'd never written on that level before, and I wanted to be a part of it. Eventually, I reworked it so much, I ended up becoming the co-author of the book. I then reached out to former Congressman Keith Ellison to write the introduction, and then we went to the galleys sometime in July. We go to that point of printing the manuscript before Sandra Bland is killed. People have asked me why there aren't many representations of women in the book, and this is partly why. After this, I'm going to go into my relaxing summer. I feel good about the book. I even get excited because on a Friday night, I get invited to promote the book on TPT Almanac. Now, that was particularly naive that I was excited as I was because I've been doing this for a while, and I know that if you talk about contemporary race relations, there can be problems. However, I left the studio that night feeling really good, thinking, what could possibly go wrong? Anytime you ask yourself that question, something's probably going to go wrong. So over the weekend, something did go pretty wrong. And that was that Larry Elder, the conservative African-American who is a pundit for Fox and Friends Weekend, did an entire segment on the book. And he says in the segment, this book is indoctrinating children to believe that Black people are victims and white people should feel guilty about it. That really wasn't the best weekend I've ever had. Now, what is wrong with the story that he presented? First of all, no one has read the book. He has seen TPT Almanac and has heard about the book, but the book has not gone to the galleys yet. It's only August 2015. The book isn't scheduled to be published until January 2016. And so there ends up being a big debate in cyberspace. The conservatives get me thrown off of Facebook. The liberals come to my defense and say it's the most brilliant book they've ever read. As flattering as that is, it's just not true. No one has read the book. And so eventually the book comes out early. It comes out in October. This is the jacket cover. And this was a monumental moment for me because it altered my career. I had spent the first 20 years of my career in the academy as a scholar, not in the public as much as I have been in the last 5 years. And this book ended up giving me a huge public presence, mostly because it was so controversial. And so what is the book really doing? I'm accused of indoctrinating white school children, but what I really want to do is answer the simple question of how do we go from Dred Scott to Michael Brown? Now you might be wondering how Dred Scott and Michael Brown are connected. If you took high school civics, you might have learned about the 1857 Supreme Court case of Dred Scott. What that's about is that he was enslaved in Missouri, and then he actually came to live at Fort Snelling in Minnesota, and was able to live as a free person. When he goes back to Missouri, he wants to continue to live as a free person. His case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and in 1857, he loses the case. He's denied citizenship. This is 6 years before the Emancipation Proclamation is signed. The Supreme Court rules, and here's the language, that a Black man has no rights that a white man is bound to respect. So I'll say that a second time. A Black man has no rights where a white man is bound to respect. How is this connected to Michael Brown? It's connected to Michael Brown because Dred Scott is in an area in Missouri that's very close proximity to where Michael Brown ends up laying on the ground hundreds of years later. And this evokes James Baldwin, that what goes around comes around. And so I have taught this book at Macalester, and some might wonder about that because it's pitched at an 8th grade level. I look at it in terms of the theme of hope and despair, and I break it into units. We do all of it in one day, but structurally I say, let's look at Reconstruction to Brown versus Board of Education within the framework of hope and despair. The hope during this time period is clearly emancipation. The despair, however, is that there's so much resistance during Reconstruction. Some people don't realize that Reconstruction is the time when we get the Klan, and it leads to 58 years of legal segregation after 246 years of slavery. Sometimes students learn that once slavery is over, people are free. Not necessarily. And so then we move on to thinking about the civil rights movement from Brown up to the Bill Clinton administration. Hope and despair. The hope is that there is federal legislation that occurs, civil rights acts leading to eliminating discrimination. The Civil Rights Act of '65 has to do with voting. And then you have fair housing, et cetera, et cetera. Also, I would be remiss if I didn't centralize the activity of Black people and say that there was a resistant politic within the Black community itself. And this is when you get the beginnings of Black feminism, Black power, and the Black arts movement. The despair is that there is tremendous resistance with the Reagan-Bush administrations. And I'm talking about both Bushes here. And this is an image of the survivors from Hurricane Katrina. And actually, if you think about the Clinton administration that comes between the Bush administrations, we learn that the Clinton administration was a lot more moderate on public policy issues related to race than sometimes people like to think. So for instance, this is a photograph from the Associated Press of President Clinton signing the Welfare to Work bill. He deliberately chooses to surround himself with African-American women, and this image makes Americans think that women who look like this would be the beneficiaries of welfare. That actually is not accurate. Now, one of the most challenging things to look at, but the question that I think is most intriguing is, why does a social movement like Black Lives Matter come about when we get our first Black president? This question alone has inspired me to teach a class on the Obama presidency. And one of the arguments that I make in this class and in one of the books that I've written is that President Obama avoided domestic US race issues for the entire first term that he was president. It isn't until his second term that he runs into the problem where the premier African-American scholar at Harvard University, Henry Louis Gates, is actually arrested inside of his home. He lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He's come back from an international business trip. He has a hard time finding his keys. His neighbors report a Black man on the porch, but he finds his keys. He gets inside of his home and the police come and they still arrest him. Gates is outraged. His counsel is Charles Ogletree and is able to get in touch with the president. The president comes up with the idea to have a beer summit. Now, the beer summit doesn't go that well, and some scholars would say that he ends up being caught between Barack and a hard place because no one is happy after the beer summit. He gathers with the vice president, Joe Biden, and the arresting officer and Professor Gates to try to smooth things out in terms of race relations, but this did not go over well. So where we find ourselves then is in the summer of 2012, where we have a situation where Trayvon Martin ends up being murdered before this, but then we realize that George Zimmerman is acquitted for this crime. This would be the moment that President Obama returns to the same space in the Rose Garden where he's had the beer summit, and he says, "If I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon." And he makes some other remarks about we need to do soul searching, we need to figure out how this happened. But this is the strongest hand that he has had in terms of race relations up until this point. And once again, younger generation is not particularly inspired by this. And so it is in this moment that you get a racial divide. And so the Washington Post tells us that 86% of African Americans are extremely upset that Zimmerman goes free, and that only 30% of white Americans are as upset as Black people are. And so it is in this time and moment that Black Lives Matter becomes a hashtag. And the way that it becomes a hashtag is that these three women, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi, all get together and start tweeting that Black Lives Matter. Now, for people who are listening to this, this might not seem that remarkable, but you have to understand how much our use of social media has changed in the last 8 years. This ends up being the beginning of cyber activism because 5 million tweets in one day was completely unusual in 2012. And so there continue to be murders of Black men by white police officers in the next 2 years. But the one that ends up getting the most media attention is Eric Garner in New York City when he says that he can't breathe. Once again, we're in a situation where we have videotape, the world knows what's going on, we get a trial, and the police officer is found not guilty. And this results in uprisings throughout the nation. Now, it isn't until the following month that Black Lives Matter moves from a hashtag to an actual movement on the ground. And this takes us to the moment where I have so much anxiety thinking about how am I going to teach this in real time? And that is when Michael Brown is killed in Ferguson. It's at this moment that people get in their cars, get on planes, fly to Missouri, and have peaceful protests, marches, and demonstrations. And Black Lives Matter takes off as what some would say is a contemporary civil rights movement. 6 months later, Freddie Gray is killed in Baltimore, Maryland. Now, it should be no surprise to anyone that Black Lives Matter has a lot of resistance. It was not a popular movement. In fact, 55% of Americans during this time period think that Black Lives Matter is actually a distraction. Now, if I were teaching this as a class, I would explain to my students, as painful as that might have been to have lived through, the March on Washington in 1963 was considered more of a threat. Now, people are actually surprised by that, but Gallup polls indicate that 60% of Americans were opposed to the March on Washington. This is surprising because we glorified this event now. And so one of the things that I have students think about is what an event is like when it's actually happening, and then how the story is told, and then how we revisit it. And so there's lots of backlash in the 1960s. Even if you look at this image of young college students sitting at a lunch counter to desegregate it, 57% of the nation thought that this was counterproductive. So, you know, we also tend to put Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on a pedestal. What we don't seem to remember is that in the 1960s, half of white America believed that Martin Luther King was harming the movement. And so all of these things are important if we talk about the contemporary moment and what has happened in the last 8 years with Black Lives Matter. And so if we bring attention to the Twin Cities, in the fall of 2015, Jamar Clark is shot. And there are numerous protests throughout the Twin Cities, and this makes national news. And even though it does, you still only have 25% of white America agreeing that Black Lives Matter has even a purpose. This would be early 2016. Now, there's going to be a change in attitude. And so public opinion in Minnesota begins to shift in the summer of 2016. And so if you're wondering what makes the tone and tenor move in our state, it would be the killing of Philando Castile. So as many of us know, Castile was shot in the head by a police officer not that far from McAllister's campus. And Dayton is still governor at the time. And he makes a statement saying that he doubted that Castile would have been shot if he'd been white. This is considered very controversial, and the governor is accused of race baiting. However, it's a very challenging week. So if you think about holiday weekends, this is very similar to what we've gone through recently. People don't want their holidays to have complete chaos. But 4 years ago, 4th of July weekend was chaos. On July 5th, Alton Sterling was killed by police officers in Baton Rouge. The next day, Philando Castile is killed. Micah Johnson, who's African American, ends up shooting up police officers in Dallas, and then the Dallas police end up retaliating and killing Micah Johnson with a bomb. All of this happens in 4 days. So in the midst of this, you get a lot of interest in the Black Lives Matter movement because people are concerned that they see a pattern. And so the top image is of a woman who's facing down the police in Baton Rouge after Alton Sterling. And then, of course, most of you all will recognize the bottom image, which is of Colin Kaepernick. And it's at this moment, he starts a wave of athletes to take a knee, and he starts supporting Black Lives Matter. And as we know, he is no longer playing football. And so all of this made me feel like I needed to write a book on policing, because policing is a separate issue from Black Lives Matter. So when I wrote the Race and Policing book, I had to put out what my claims were. And so what do I argue? One of the things I argue is that this is really more than policing. There are other public policy issues at hand. We also have to talk about how the government has been complicit in some of the social issues that we have. Banks and lawmakers aided and abetted with white flight in the 1960s and 70s, which continues housing discrimination and practices like redlining. All of this urban decay ends up with crime and poverty that you don't have in the suburbs, but African Americans don't have access to the suburbs. So this leads to us questioning, what is the war on drugs and what does it mean? One of the terrible outcomes of the war on drugs is the discrepancy between the sentencing between people who are caught with crack cocaine and powder cocaine. And so this ends up having a devastating impact on Black communities. By the early 1990s, Black people were 5 times more likely to be arrested for a drug offense than a white person committing the same crime. Black people made up 40% of all drug-related arrests, despite being 12% of the population. And so when we think about policing, we have to ask ourselves, what is the purpose of policing? It's to serve and protect. But we also need to ask ourselves, how is policing either organized or structured? So policing falls into 3 categories: federal, statewide, and local. So think of, say, the FBI, your highway patrolman, your sheriff, right? These are different roles. Now, there are no set requirements that all police officers must achieve. What we do know is that most of the training for police officers has at least 60 hours for firearms. Sadly, only 8 hours to think about cultural diversity. And so people who have been concerned about policing have wondered, how can the police be policed? This has been a challenge because there are laws that protect the police. In fact, the only police officer who's been indicted for killing a citizen in recent years has been a Black police officer who killed a white woman. So with that, we have to ask ourselves, what is the impact of stop and frisk? How does it disproportionately impact men of color? The state of New York ruled it unconstitutional in 2013, but the US Court of Appeals overruled the decision, so we still have stop and frisk. Many police officers are defensive about Black Lives Matter. They say Blue Lives Matter. They say it's not fair to disparage an entire profession, that there are a few bad apples, but that does not mean that all of policing is corrupt. They also argue that people who say Black Lives Matter don't talk about Black on Black crime. And so that's their position. So where are we today? One of the reasons why I think I was asked to do this webinar is because everyone knows we have experienced a tragedy. And so over Memorial Weekend, George Floyd is murdered in Minneapolis, and it is incomprehensible how violent this was and the impact that this has had on the world. One of the things that has shocked me, because I do this for a living and I've watched the resistance to Black Lives Matter and the resistance to talk about race and policing, is how there's been a radical change in the public sentiment. There's no better example than how public opinion has shifted when you would think that on June 7th, Republican Senator Mitt Romney takes to the streets, joins a rally, and tweets, Black Lives Matter. And so this would have been unthinkable years ago, but there's been a change in the tide. And so the outcry hasn't just been in the United States, it's been global. This is a statue in London of Winston Churchill, where someone has spray painted Churchill out and replaced it with "was a racist." And so with that, we have to ask ourselves, what is happening on the ground in Minnesota? And this is where your charge comes in. And so the legislature has a People of Color and Indigenous Caucus. And this group has been promoting a Police Accountability Act, which has three major focuses: reclaiming community oversight, reforming accountability, and reimagining public safety. As a response, the Republicans came up with a proposal that had some very interesting, important things, including autism training, mental health training, use of force reporting. All of these things are significant. What's interesting, however, is that in turn, the Democrats came back with 13 additional demands that they wanted in this legislation. And we can talk about that during question and answer. And so this is what Black Lives Matter looks like. This is outside of the state capitol about 10 days ago. And so this is where we are. Now, the legislative efforts that have happened in the last 10 days are that the bill passed in the House 71-59, but it failed in the Senate. And so the bill will be reintroduced in mid-July. And this is where I'm making my request. In the meantime, anyone who's on this webinar, even if you don't live in Minnesota, you can contact Minnesota state representatives of both parties and express your concern. In fact, Representative Carlos Mariani is a MAC alum, class of 1979. And so people often say that what they would have done during the 60s. They say, if I were there, I would have done this, I would have done that. I would say that the opportunity has presented itself again. And so tomorrow, there'll be a town hall meeting on police accountability and reform. If you live in Minnesota, it'll be in Maple Grove, and it's hosted by the Minnesota DFL, which is Democratic Farmer Labor, if you're not a Minnesotan, with the People of Color and Indigenous Caucus. And so with that, I will close out by saying, if you have grand ideas of what you would have done if you had been a part of a movement in a different time period, I really challenge yourself to realize that the time to act is now. And so please do, and thank you.
Well, thank you, Duchess, for such an informative presentation. So much to absorb in what you shared with us.
Are you going to write me a paper about that, Justin?
Yeah. Like I said, well, as you said, I survived 3 of your classes, so I guess I'm still on the hook. So I'm going to go through the questions here, and I've been kind of reframing the order here based on just kind of what you shared and kind of how I'm processing. So I'll kind of start with I guess one of the first questions that we have here is, and these are questions from our readers. Do you think that the ground has shifted in the conversation on reform versus abolition?
I really think it has. I mean, to be honest with you, I don't think there was much of an audience for abolition as recently as 6 months ago. I think the incident of George Floyd being killed has changed the conversation around the world. And I mean, just empirically, because I don't know how many people are watching from outside of the state and if people are following local politics. Last week, the Minneapolis City Council voted to abolish the Minneapolis Police Department. There's a time limit on it. So I don't want people to think that, it's done. It hasn't necessarily happened, but the fact that it was actually unanimous says a lot about how this one event has changed so much in our culture.
And another question kind of related to how you just answered that. Do you see a difference in how St. Paul and Minneapolis have addressed everything that's happened in the last, month, 6 weeks?
I actually don't, because I find their policing to be very similar, which is that I think that there's conscientious policing in both cities. And the mayor of St. Paul's, many of you all know, comes from a policing family. His father is a retired policeman and they're African American. His mom is a county commissioner. And so I think there is a commitment in St. Paul. And I feel like there was a commitment to reform when Philando Castile happened. I just don't think the world responded the way people in St. Paul responded.
Mm. And speaking about that and thinking about how the Twin Cities is such a healthy activist community, the question here is, what organizations do you feel are doing vital work to combat structural racism, and how best can we support them?
I'm impressed by the leadership of the Minneapolis NAACP. That organization right now is being led by Leslie Redmond. She actually lectured in my race and the law class before we went into quarantine. She came to my class. It must have been late February, early March. And she's a young woman. She's 28 years old. She's on the rise. And she has the ear of local government. I know that she had a conference call with the governor today, and that they are working in collaboration to try to move the state forward.
Thank you. And this next question will kind of continue on the thread about kind of policing and this conversation. The next question is a little more complicated, that has been around the country in this space, is how can we answer persons who do not seem to understand that you can respect and honor our good police officers and know there must be change?
Right. I mean, I think that's a challenge because there are just some people in the world that can't hold two concepts in their head at the same time, right? Which is why I'm celebrating the leadership of St. Paul, because I think that St. Paul's Mayor Melvin Carter III recognizes that there's good policing. He was raised by good policing. I think that he also knows there needs to be police reform. His dad has written a beautiful autobiography, and one of the things he says in it is that he felt more intimidated sometimes when he was in uniform than when he was just walking in plain clothes, and so much of that had to do with the fact that he was Black.
All right, so next, a great segue here for the next question. So, thinking about his father in that sense, when people talk about community policing, what exactly does that look like?
Community policing involves people who are not actually police officers. So this opens up the question of what is the role of social workers, what is the role of fire department, and then people have critiques of that as well. I mean, I just want to put out here right now, this is going to be messy because people want quick solutions, they want clean solutions. And so as soon as you start talking about community policing, Some people will respond, well, I think some of the social workers are problematic. That might be true, but we're in a moment now where people are thinking about concepts that no one was thinking about as recently as, last year.
And so thinking about the community policing, years ago, Camden, got national attention for their movement to essentially abolish the city police department and go to kind of a county community policing. So have you seen, outside of Camden, where that has been successful, have you seen other places or spaces where the model that we're hoping to get in the Twin Cities, or in Minneapolis at least, works?
I understand that some efforts have been made in Dallas. And then there is the whole issue of Mayor Garcetti in Los Angeles giving less funding to policing and giving some of that money in other spaces. I think the entire country is making a shift. I honestly can't point to one place and say, they haven't figured out. I'm not sure if anyone has quite figured out, but I think the fact that a city as large as Los Angeles is even considering reform means we've come so far. I came of age in the era of Rodney King. And so I remember that like it was yesterday. I mean, that was my first year of graduate school. Absolutely no police reform would have been thought of in the early 90s.
Thanks. And you talked about social workers and kind of, what this new community policing can look like. And, another thread that has come up is mental health.
Exactly.
And how this affects communities of color, and, who really should be the first responder to different kinds of situations. Can you speak a little bit to that? Or what you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the concerns about mental health is that people who are not comfortable in certain communities, and we can expand this beyond a black-white paradigm, right? People who go into the Hmong community, people who go into the Somali community, the Latinx community, they might not recognize how mental illness looks like in that community. That's a problem, right? But we need to name it before we can get to it. And I think the fact that we're even thinking about mental illness right now is critical to keep safety in neighborhoods when there might not actually be crime happening.
So now we're going to go a little deeper.
Okay.
So more back into the theory, at least the times I remember my classes on campus.
Right.
So, the next question is, why do you think race issues seem to be new news to white America? Black lives have always mattered, but now seems, since there is public attention, now we really matter.
Well, I'll be honest with you. I discussed that in my home last night for more than an hour. And I think it's because we can return to the 1968 Kerner Commission, which said that we are living in two societies. And so I think one of the things that happened was that for some white Americans, and I'm never going to say all white Americans, for some white Americans, George Floyd was shocking. I think for many Black Americans, it wasn't as shocking because the presentation that I just did is often in the forefront of the mind of Black Americans. And so I think what some white Americans don't realize is that Black Americans will walk through the world and they will think Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Shamar Clark, Freddie Gray, that's in their head. And that is a part of what it means to be Black in America. And so I think that's why we've had these different responses. I mean, Black women are asking, why hasn't anyone been arrested for the killing of Breonna Taylor, right? And so people have different things in their consciousness. But if I go back to Baldwin says, if you're Black and you're conscious and you're not enraged, that's not even a mathematical equation. And so I think that's how this comes about.
and kind of looking at this in the way that I have as well. A lot of people talk about, this is the time, let's keep moving, get the movement going. Uh, Unfortunately, my response is always, let's see where we are in about a year from now.
Oh my
You know,
goodness, I agree with you 100%. One of my favorite New York Times columnists is Charles Blow, and he said, I hope people don't treat this like it's Coachella, right? Like this should not be, going to what my parents' generation would have been Woodstock, right? So, okay, everybody, let's get our Black Lives Matter t-shirts. Let's go, let's protest, then let's get some snacks after. And then whenever the next cool thing comes along, we'll do that too. Yeah, that's a problem.
so how do you think we can continue this momentum so that hopefully we're not in that space a year from now?
To me, the momentum really should come to a head on November 3rd, right? This is like what I was saying in the race and policing book. If you think it's just about policing, that's not what anyone's saying. This is public policy. So this isn't just voting, this is voter suppression, right? And so this is about housing, this is about jobs, this is all these different things. And so if we let this go, we're letting many things go.
Can you expand on that a little bit? Just because, when we get into this space, people want to just kind of, or else I shouldn't say that, but people look at, this is about police brutality and not necessarily the historic oppression or prejudice that the communities of color in the Twin Cities have faced. Can you unpack that a little bit?
I mean, here's how Black Lives Matter. I'm going to talk about someone like Stacey Abrams, okay? And this is not saying anything about what her role should be in America now or in the future. I'm going to talk about what she has done. She has had a national campaign to address the issue of how polling places have been closed in areas that are concentrated by people of color. Even when we had primaries going on during COVID, that people were lined up with masks on for hours trying to get to vote. That has everything to do with Black Lives Mattering. The issue is that we have a disconnect in our culture around who has really thought about the fact that they could have lived their whole life so far and not engaged the notion that a lot of people don't think Black Lives Matter.
I was talking, I'm a high school principal, and as I was talking to one of my students, they said to me, so how are we going to address the twin pandemics that are happening right now? The course of the, COVID-19 and what we're talking about today. And so I want to dig a little deeper. Can you share just maybe how dealing with twin pandemics for communities of color, how that is or may be different for what the white community?
Well, there's a man that I really admire, Bishop Michael Curry. I admire him for his leadership in the Episcopal Church. If people aren't familiar with that, in terms of pop culture, he is the person who married Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. And in one of his recent sermons, he said, Black America is suffering from COVID-19. Okay, that's what the problem is. And what he meant by that is that everything that makes COVID what it is for white America is compounded for Black Americans. Wow. Because Black Americans were already fragile. And so Black Americans already had issue with access to everything, right? Sitting in places that were food deserts, sitting in places that didn't have the best housing, that didn't have community policing, that didn't have great health care. And if you had any of those things, you might not have a job. And so that's what COVID-19 is that you already had all the problems. Now you're in a pandemic.
So thinking about that and trying to continue that conversation, one of the questions here is, and I want to kind of transition to kind of education piece and more conversations. how do we encourage white friends to have race and justice conversations among themselves about their complicity in systemic inequity and not be there as the spokesperson for all Black people?
You know, that's a challenge. I mean, I'm sure you can imagine that given what I do for a living, I get lots of emails, right? I wake up and I have lots of emails, and a lot of the emails are from white Americans who want me to fix something for them, which is why I opened up today's presentation by saying there are many things that I'm not capable of fixing. The challenge really is having white Americans having the courage to say, we're going to try this on our own. And that takes a lot of courage because our nation isn't structured so they would have learned anything. I mean, that's why I like writing these books, because K through 12 hasn't allowed space for people to have this skill set. And it's only been until recently that people even realize this is a skill set.
So in writing, and now in your writing, now that you've shifted to, I guess, the population I work with more closely,
Yeah.
what do you think is missing in kind of the approach to teaching? I'll just call it a full American history.
Well, I went to high school in 1983, and the methodology then was colorblind. And even though we've moved from colorblind to diversity, there really isn't a lot of conversation about justice and what justice looks like. And then there isn't a lot of historical context. And so that's why you have this dilemma with people who are shocked with George Floyd. It's because they didn't learn about Emmett Till in high school. And so if you knew that this has been going on ever since emancipation, which is why I framed the talk the way that I did, this would be a different moment for you.
And so thank you for that. I was a former U.S. history teacher. And I remember right after, graduating from McAllister, teaching U.S. history and supplementing a lot of what the textbook had with, in the early 2000s, we're going to learn about Black Wall Street.
Yeah.
And I remember my students saying, Mr. Brandon, are we going to learn about another kind of racist act in the United States?
Right, because there's probably only one more.
No. And I would just say this is all U.S. history. This is all American history. And so kind of thinking about those kind of conversations, one of the questions here is, how do you have this conversation with kids? And let me just kind of read it through a little bit. So the question is, what are some tangible things you can do to initiate a conversation with kids? And are there questions you should ask to begin a discussion with young people, or ways to make lessons out of games that talk about race, diversity, and inequities?
I think that it depends on the age of the child, but regardless of the age of the child, a good way to open up is to ask them, what do they see? What do they know? And so I had my first experience with this as a parent with George Floyd. And the reason why is that when Philando Castile happened, my kids weren't old enough for technology. My daughter was 11, my son was 8. When George Floyd happened, I paused and said, okay, how am I going to approach this? I will admit, as a parent, I was a day late and $1 short. Because when I approached my 13-year-old, he said, I saw the video. And I couldn't believe that he watched the video. And I told him how concerned I was about him watching the video. And he said, Mom, 20 million people have seen it on Instagram. Why wouldn't I watch it? And of course, my 16-year-old daughter was like, oh yeah, I saw it too. And so that part of it now is you can run, but you can't hide. I wanted to talk to them about it, but if I'd been one of those parents that wanted to talk about something else, it's there anyway.
And so, in that kind of conversation, some of the rhetoric that came out of the unrest that our cities faced was the critique of Black people, the looting and the violence and the burning of the cities,
Mhm.
and there was this juxtaposition of white journalists or non-Black journalists commenting about the Black community, kind of burning their community down. So how can people talk more about that to help understand that dynamic?
Well, my 13-year-old son asked my husband that. So he
Mm,
said, why are people burning down these stores in the community? Right? I mean, you have to think he's a young teenager. So in South Minneapolis, they burnt the Wendy's. My kid was like, who would burn a Wendy's? Right? Um, what my husband ends up explaining to him is that as Black people, for the absolute most part, like we're really talking about 99%, we don't own businesses, right? We don't own franchises.
mm.
When these things are being burnt, people are burning down their frustrations. They're not destroying themselves. They don't feel connected to these spaces at all. And that's not to say, okay, go out and burn down a Wendy's, right? And I shouldn't even have to say that I'm not saying that, but I'll just put that out there. No one's advocating for that. But I think that if you've never lived in an impoverished neighborhood that struggled, that had strife, that had difficulty, and if you've never been treated the way some people have been treated, where now if you're Black, if you're not wearing a mask, people just kick you out and don't say, can you just put your mask on? Or if you applied for a job at one of these franchises and couldn't even get one, if you haven't had those daily indignities, you wouldn't understand why someone would just say, well, we can just burn it down.
So no, that's it there. Well, there's a question that just came in that is very relevant to this, and it is. Um, I have a hard time understanding how any Black person cannot be outraged and supportive of change. So when I see seemingly intelligent Black people like Candace Owens
Sure,
and any other people of color trying to
sure.
hurt the Black Lives Matter movement, it is difficult to understand. So, what is your perspective on Candace Owens and others, like you mentioned in your presentation?
Right. Well, when you were in my class, Justin, clearly we wouldn't have been talking about Candace Owens in particular.
Mm.
But in Black public intellectuals, we talk about the range of political thought within the African American community. The African American community is not a monolith. The African American community has always had conservatives. Booker T. Washington was a conservative. Okay. The African Americans who've gone the furthest in presidential cabinets have been Republicans. That would be both Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice in the
Mhm.
Bush administration. And so there's room for variety in Blackness in the way that there should be room for variety in anything, right? Are Candace Owens and I going to agree on much? Probably not, right? But I'm not sure that she needs to be me. I don't think that that's what being a citizen is about. There should be free thought.
Well said. Well said. I think that's a challenging question because there's always this trap of shouldn't all Black people be on one team, essentially.
I don't think that that is realistic in many ways. I mean, one thing that I think about is when we had the memorial for George Floyd here and Al Sharpton spoke. And Al Sharpton is 65, and I grew up on the East Coast. And so I have memories of Al Sharpton being active in New York before he became more of a national figure. And I wonder if my 16-year-old daughter hears Al Sharpton speak and it resonates with her. And so one of the differences we need to think about are generational differences. I don't think there's any reason in the world why my kids should see the world the way that I do. I didn't see the world the way my parents did. My parents were born in the 1930s and they lived in segregation until they were 35 years old. That's very different from how I grew up, which is also very different from how my kids are growing up. So Black people can't be all alike.
So the next one I want to get to, and then I want to get to Mac in a second. The next one kind of talks about that too. Is can you talk a little bit about your perspective on the term BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, People of Color, especially as it has emerged recently on the context of Black Lives Matter and police brutality? The person goes on to say, in my experience, I'm seeing it used primarily by white people and criticized or disregarded by the people it's meant to describe.
You know, I will humbly say that I'm in the middle generation now. And so I don't feel comfortable speaking to what Leslie Redmond's generation of 20, she's 28 years old, what she would say of, you know, BIPOC, right?
Mm.
I would say that I come from a tradition that embraces Black, right? My kids say African American. I will always say Black, but I will always say Black because I'm from a particular moment in a particular time. And so BIPOC, I don't know. You know, I don't know if that's something that white people are saying that people of color don't like. I know in the legislature, that's what they call themselves.
And now in a couple of minutes left, looking at Mac, there are a couple of questions about McAllister. And since this is all new and we're all learning every day is kind of a new adventure with all of this, the question is, you know, what specific new measures will McAllister introduce to encourage more community engagement between current students and the surrounding community?
Well, one thing I have to say is that I'm really close to the people in the community engagement office, and I think that we already do a fantastic job. And to be honest with you, I think that we've consistently done a good job ever since I've been at McAllister. The challenges now, I think, are more related to COVID, not necessarily, you know, what are we going to do to, you know, engage communities of color in the Twin Cities. I know I've always done that, and September will mark my 26th year. I think sometimes people might not realize what's going on campus because there's so many different things that are going on. And so my sincere response would be to find out what's actually happening, and if that's not working for you, seeing how you could make that better.
That's a good answer. Mac has always, at least in my experience, always been part of the community there. I was fully integrated into the Twin Cities, all the work that I was doing. And the last one here is, can you share what you may know about how McAllister is now engaging or has engaged with police and policing, you know, in terms of the St. Paul police, or what that may look like?
Sure. I mean, what I can say is that our new president, Dr. Rivera, has put out a statement that she is going to explore what our relationship has been to the St. Paul police in terms of security. What I encourage people to keep in mind is that we are a very different place than the University of Minnesota. And so, you know, the University of Minnesota, when they have their events and tens of thousands of people are there before COVID, right? That's policing of an entirely different nature than we have a student body of 2,000 people. And so I'm not even sure how much of a challenge it will be to address that, given how small we are.
Good point. And lastly, you know, thinking about this conversation on a national, international scale, you talked about this earlier, but I want to kind of close with this just reminder. You know, can you talk about some of the tangible things folks can really do in their municipalities to affect
Sure,
change?
sure. I mean, as I said before, the legislation is going to be reintroduced in July. Even if you don't live in Minnesota, you can contact both the state reps, the state senators, both political parties. And you can also research what is happening in your state if you're in the US. And then if you're outside of the US, you can ask yourself what's happening there. Because I promise you, this is not just a US problem at all. Ask people, particularly in urban spaces, how this manifests itself in another country, and you will hear similar stories.
Thank you, thank you. And the last one before I'll close. is, the last question here is, when are you running for office?
When am I running for office?
That's what's here.
You set me up, Justin. Oh, you're lucky you're an alum. That would have been a B+. I am not really interested in that. It's very funny to me that people ask me that question quite often. I enjoy writing about politics. I enjoy teaching about politics. I don't think it's my calling to participate in politics, but never say never. I like to think of myself as youthfully middle-aged. So maybe it would be my act 2.
Thank you. That's it in terms of questions. I want to just give you an opportunity if you have any other closing thoughts as we wrap up.
Just that it really has been an honor and a privilege to be a part of this. It was disappointing for everyone that we couldn't have an in-person alumni event. And so I'm deeply touched that I was asked to do this. I encourage people to reach out to me, to visit my website. And also, I'm not sure if people realize that my Duchess Harris collection is free electronically for another month. And so that information should be available as well. And so that'll give people access to some of my work.
Great plug. And I can say that I have a good number of your collection in my office. And I'd say people, please go visit that website to get the free version and then buy the hard copies for loved ones and yourselves and your families.
Thank you so much, Justin.
You're welcome. So now in closing, Duchess, thank you so much. This was great and so timely. Thank you. This provided me with some good chance for reflection on how we are doing in the new world today. So thank you. As I close, I just need to share that first, thank you all of you for joining us and for engaging today as alumni and community members. We appreciate your commitment to Macalester and the time you've taken with us today. As we mentioned, we'll be sharing a recording of this video and links that we discussed on the Mac Together webpage. Excuse me. We do have a request for each of you. First is complete the post-webinar survey and share additional conversations you'd like to have or ways you'd like to connect with the Macalester community. The next is we have put together a list of resources on the Mac Together website on how to support racial justice. The link is also posted in the chat. Next, if you haven't had a chance to read President Rivera's message on Macalester and racial justice initiatives, which she's been very prolific in a very short period of time, I'll add, please do so. It can be found linked on the Mac Together page and posted in the chat there. Lastly, before you go, we will share Professor Harris's website, I think one more time, to make sure you're able to go and visit her collection. And lastly, Duchess, thank you again for everything that you've done for me personally in my time at Macalester, and that you continue to do for all of the students, all of the community members, to make our experiences better and to provide windows and mirrors for our community. Thank you so much.
Be well, everybody.
Thank you. Go Mac.